I mean, when we start to talk about a lot of these rookies and a lot of these picks and how things lay out, I mean, another point you made earlier about Xavier Worthy, as you were talking about like the Lad McConkey ceiling, and you were talking about McConkey and Keon Coleman, could you really see them be worth a first round pick next year in a rookie draft, or like have had such a good season that if you had dealt them away, that their value rises that much? And the point about the Xavier Worthy, and probably, Sean, we should talk a little bit about Worthy. We should talk a little bit about Rome Odunze. I joked earlier that I got asked about Dunze a lot, and maybe we weren't even going to be able to talk about him because we spent so much time emailing about him. But one of the things, as we talked about that, and I went back and did some more research and all that stuff that kept kind of popping out to me is, we talked about this before on the show, and I talked about it with the rookie guide, that I loved your write-ups. I loved how you talked about their journey through college, their pedigree, coming out of high school, who they are, this sort of like Devi element that you have added to your analysis. I think maybe just in the last half decade. I don't know if that's true or not, but I've heard you reference it more than, say, when you and I first started working together more like 7 or 8 years ago. I don't really remember you referencing sort of the high school profiles as much, maybe. But that is a really interesting element as it relates to Xavier Worthy, who, spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't looked at Sean's rankings, he does have ranked ahead of Odunze, and a few spots ahead of Odunze, with some quarterbacks falling in between there. And not a lot of the people do. And a lot of people are looking at Worthy and saying he's undersized. A lot of his production was sort of gimmicky, or was the stuff that comes around the line of scrimmage. And there's other receivers that have had similar distribution of targets that have been busts in recent classes, and that's been a big concern about him as well. He wasn't super efficient the last couple of years. He had a really good freshman year. He's a 3-year early declare, but he was sort of worse each of the next 2 years almost. But a lot of that goes back to, or if you're pro Worthy, it goes back to Quinn Ewers, the quarterback, and all of those things not being as good of a quarterback. But the really interesting point, I think, for me, as we were talking through this and thinking about Worthy, is the element that he was really highly recruited out of high school. He was a really high caliber prospect, correct? I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I know, as I was looking through some of the old RotoViz work, Stefan Lacko, is it? I'm sorry, I don't remember how to pronounce his last name, Stefan, but he had written up sort of what the 2024 first round of rookie drafts would look like last summer, going into the final college season. You don't even know who's all going to early declare. You certainly don't know who's going to have the great season or anything. But at that time, he had Worthy ranked basically right behind Marvin Harrison. He had Odunze multiple tiers later, which we've talked about this with Odunze's profile, where he had a really good junior year in 2022. But him and Jalen McMillan were both very good in a high-volume passing game. He didn't really necessarily dominate it. And in 2020 and 2021, he wasn't great. I'll make excuses for that because our offense was horrible before we brought in Kalen DeBoer in 2022. But Odunze's been great the last 2 seasons. But the point is, coming into last year, Odunze, who was not a massive recruit out of high school, he was a strong recruit, but not like a massive one, was somebody that wasn't looked at as a first-round pick. I mean, I think some of the mocks already had him sort of as a first-round pick, but I know in dynasty circles, it wasn't like, this guy's profile is incredible. And then he has the incredible 2023 season, but a little bit more of a late bloomer, as opposed to Worthy, who's somebody who was a strong high school prospect, the incredible rookie year, and is already up there near the top of the class until he sort of falls back a little bit. Now, I have some concerns about that as well that I want to ask you about, because Worthy, we both know that people think the prime of players in football is a lot longer than it actually is, that players can sustain a level of production for a lot longer than they actually can. It's one of those things where, like, it's always hard when we talk about the breakout players and people are basically like, that guy's never done it before. And it's like, but every year we see somebody do something that they haven't done before. And then also, it's, if you wait until you've seen it for multiple years and you can trust this guy's a lock for this many yards, he's not going to give you that anymore. The peak of NFL players outside the top upper echelon, even good ones, is like 3 years. I mean, on average. I mean, it's not 7, 8, 10 years. It's like, you get 3 years maybe sometimes of really strong, consistent, similar production Otherwise, players have to evolve into new roles and into new offenses and stuff. It makes what a guy like a Mike Evans has done so incredible. But so I do have some, that's part of one of my questions for you about Worthy, where like the freshman year production is fantastic. We know the early production is fantastic. We know that when we model things, that looks incredible. But the fact that he hasn't been quite as good the last couple of years does scare me a little bit. It reminds of some of the profiles that I really liked. Like I'm not trying to compare him to these players, but like a Laviska Shenault, who had this monster dominator rating as a sophomore, wasn't as good as a junior, comes into the NFL and is like not as fast, has lost a step. I don't think Worthy's lost a step. He just ran a 4.21 at the combine, but that's an example. Jalen Reagor is a guy who didn't have a great final season, but had a good earlier season. And then there's examples like Juju Smith-Schuster, who had a good earlier season and his production fell off in his final season. And then he went on to be a superstar early as a freshman, as a rookie, and as a second-year player. So there's counter examples to that as well. And we know the early production matters, but Worthy being sort of, now 3 years removed from that freshman year is mildly concerning as well. So there's a lot of, I think, interlocking conversation points there, Shawn. What I found fascinating, I mentioned that we talked a lot about this. What we were talking a lot about was like, because you said at one point to me, you do really like Odunze, and I eventually had to come back and be like, Shawn, you have him ranked 10th. And I don't think you're allowed to say you like him when everyone else in the market has him ranked like 6th to 8th, and he goes much higher than 10th in every draft. But again, that's because the top 10 was sort of a tier, you have your tier break right after that. And I don't think you are being disingenuous whatsoever in saying that you really like Odunze as a profile, but I did get some questions that were like, why does Shawn have him so low? And I know that's something that people wanted you to address if you had more to offer, I guess, in that realm, because it, relative to where most everyone else is ranking him in the rookie drafts, it becomes a so low thing. It becomes, it gets the word so thrown in there. Which, again, you have him in the same tier as Xavier Worthy. You don't have him way lower valued. And part of the reason he comes in at 10 is because you are very high on a couple of the quarterbacks. But yeah, I guess the conversation starts with the Worthy and Odunze wide receiver profiles. And part of why I jumped into that was to say this conversation about explosiveness. It was about the McConkey and Keon Coleman thing, to circle all the way back on my long-winded point. But you were talking about, can those guys raise that value? Xavier Worthy, a player really highly thought of all throughout college. Then the Chiefs trade up in the first round to get him. If all the things we were chasing with Mecole Hardman and Sky Moore and didn't hit, do hit with Xavier Worthy, not just efficiency in the passing game because you have Mahomes, but the massive pass rate, the Andy Reid offense, the ability to get scheme guys open, all of those things. If Worthy is the exceptional prospect that even maybe Rice wasn't that exception. I mean, maybe Worthy's on a different level than anyone else. It's a Tyreek Hill scenario. I mean, he's not Tyreek Hill the player, but in terms of production and value jump, it could be something like that. You can see him ranked in the top 10 of all dynasty receivers, maybe the top 5 in a couple of seasons if he's that dominant of a player and a prospect. And I know that's part of why you have him so high, is you're looking at ceiling. You're looking at this monster potential for him. So anyway, we'll talk a little bit about your thoughts now that I've tried to explain what I think you're thinking about Worthy and Odunze.
I was just smiling there because I was thinking about how many picks we would have missed if we were trying to draft currently. I very justifiably get mostly joking criticism about the filibuster, but I did enjoy that one there. No,
listen, if you're gonna rank someone ahead of Rome Odunze, I'm gonna talk for 20 minutes about why you did it before I even let you explain yourself.
Worthy's a fascinating one, and I don't want to ignore or try and sweep under the rug the fact that part of why I like him is it's fun, right? And that I like to enjoy fantasy football. I like to root for the guys that I think have massive game-breaking upside, and then like every Sunday you're going to turn on the TV and you're like, I want to watch that team. I want to watch that guy. And he's a threat to go 70 yards every time he touches the ball. So part of it is going to be enthusiasm. But the other element of it is that I do think that his profile is a little bit misunderstood. And some of this I rely on sources that I have a lot of respect for, like Travis May. And one of the things that he's talked about is that Worthy can do everything. And that's kind of where he's a little bit misunderstood, in that he can do the underneath stuff. He can do the McCole Hardman stuff. He's wicked over the top. So he can do the Tyreek Hill stuff. He can do the, what they were hoping to get from Marquez Valdes-Scantling. And you see that actually in the profile, which is interesting. He has this freshman season that is extraordinary. And one of the things that, I mentioned to you, and I always want to be a little bit careful about giving a certain stat and saying, like, this is the stat that we should be always keeping in the front of our minds every time we talk about the two players, because it shouldn't be. It's much more complicated than that. But one of the things that is interesting when we talk about trajectories is that Worthy hit the same number of yards per team attempt as a freshman that Odunze did in his senior season that allowed him to vault into the top 10 picks. And one of our earlier shows this month or last month was about how individual stats like yards per team attempt, while very, very helpful in illuminating, some of the predictive elements of what a guy actually did on the field, you can get in trouble if you're just relying on that one thing. And there's also the case of that final season is also in many ways going to be the most predictive season. So you don't want to ignore if a guy was bad, like Worthy arguably was, right? So we have conflicting, interesting points there as we're working through it. But Worthy with the fantastic freshman season, and he comes out and has this sophomore campaign where he puts up an extraordinary number in air yards per route, and it just blows away every other player in the last 5 years. So when we think about him being like an underneath manufactured touch guy, that doesn't jibe with those sophomore air yard numbers, which we know from Josh's fantastic work and everything that has been done since. And the air yards are very helpful, right? They create this environment in which you have more total volume that you can work through. And certainly the Chiefs are going to be drafting some of that.
Real quick on that point, I just want to add the weighted targets per route run stat. His sophomore season was even way higher than his freshman season, 0.89. It matches Marvin Harrison's final season as basically the two single best seasons of anyone that is sort of near the top of all the receivers from my research on the different per route stuff. It's incredibly, incredibly strong. But I know, Shawn, one thing before we move on from that, I know what some people would say is that with the underneath comment is that that's where a lot of the production came from, because his yards per target was also really, really weak. There wasn't a lot of production on all that downfield volume. And there's really actually almost none, because this massive number of air yards, I have it as just under 2,000 air yards, and he has 757 receiving yards. I mean, it's a crazy gap.
The conversion rate was astonishingly low. And I break down a lot of this information in an article that's kind of hidden from people because they're not interested in Devontae Walker, who is really the focal point of the article. But the point that you make there, and that it's really interesting, and that Pete has mentioned on a few of our streams, I think including maybe on the ship chasing one, Ben, when you were absent, the catchable targets for Worthy, he has one of the lowest rates of any of the players. So again, we kind of get back to this question of like, how much is on him? Because the quarterback is going to rely on the receiver actually being where he's supposed to be, right? You can't just say, oh, well, the quarterback was inaccurate time after time after time. But one of the things that we also see, and is interesting, is that Adonai Mitchell also had this problem, which is that in the following year, and that's where we get also this sort of underneath element. And I think it's so fascinating when we think through Mitchell's profile. And you had just mentioned to me as we were talking before the show that you just selected Mitchell ahead of Xavier Legette in the quarantine league that we have with Mike Leone and a bunch of other awesome guys from the industry there. And one of the things that's hard when you're picking Mitchell is you look at the production numbers and you're like, this doesn't really match up, right? But one of the things that happened is that Mitchell comes in and they use him in this most recent season on the deep targets. And then for both of those guys, when they are deep, the percentage of catchable targets is low. Now, the interesting thing is that on those catchable targets, Worthy actually did still struggle. And so we don't want to, completely wipe out or gloss over some of the weaknesses that Worthy may have demonstrated. And again, one of the reasons that the second year numbers I think were terrible is because of a hand injury, right? So there are some things that explain some of these things. But when you're talking about Mitchell gaining these vertical targets over someone who runs a 4.2 flat, then that for me is very promising for him. One of the things that I've tried to do over the last decade is just incorporate humility as much as possible into every element of how I play fantasy. And part of that includes the production profiles for receivers, which I think is incredibly important. And when I say incredibly important, I think they need to be productive, right? When we go back and look at Mitchell, we see that he loses the middle season essentially to injury. In the first season, you're in that quagmire in Georgia where he is the guy. It's not Jermaine Burton and it's not Ladd McConkey. He is the guy who runs the most routes and he is the guy who generates the most air yards, right? Now, again, the air yards didn't convert. And so the numbers don't look as good for him compared to some of those other guys on a per route basis. But then you take that and you also look at some of the issues that he ran into in Texas, where the catchable targets that he got were not a very high percentage of the overall targets. Now, again, some of that you can probably put on him. But I think when you're looking at a guy who is that athletic and is that interesting to the NFL, that when people are saying, he could be a mid-first round pick, when you look at where he's still going in best ball. And Ben, Mitchell's best ball ADP makes absolutely no sense. And I say that as someone who pushes back on this idea that he was unproductive in college, because I think that's the wrong way to look at it. But the best ball ADP, I think, again, does give us some information because there is a cohort of drafters out there who are saying, you guys are wrong. We want to be all in on Mitchell. You want to take that as a data point as you're working through these players. So I guess as we look through Worthy, there are so many positives, and I think there are explanations for the areas that are weak. And then you have this fun comp that Andy Reid gives of Deshaun Jackson. And because I'm, such a Xavier Worthy enthusiast, I'm like, I don't know. I mean, he's not just a deep guy like Deshaun Jackson. It seems like Deshaun Jackson is a little bit of the floor outcome. And then I look up Deshaun Jackson's numbers. Rookie year, 1,008 yards from scrimmage, 3 touchdowns. Second year, 1,293 and 10. Third year, 1,160 and 7. Fourth year, 1,004. He had a bad year in his fifth year, comes back 1,334 and 9, 1,176 and 6, has an off year. At age 30, he goes for 1,004. Ben, Deshaun Jackson is not a floor comp for Xavier Worthy. That would be a fantastic NFL career.
Yeah, the amazing part of that is you look at his yards per target year in and year out, and how that compared to some of his teammates and how that elevated his quarterbacks who, when they played with Deshaun Jackson, always had higher yards per attempt than any other point in their career. I mean, even when he wasn't producing, he was elevating the passing game because he was drawing so much attention, because when he did draw the target, it was 10 plus yards per target most of the seasons of his career, and sometimes 11 plus, and just massive numbers from him over his whole career. Just a really dynamic player. I think a lot of people will balk at that a little bit just because of the efficiency thing again, where Xavier Worthy wasn't as efficient the last couple of years. He never had a 10 yards per target season in college. Now, you make some great points. You already addressed this. It's the catchable target rate is the counter for the pro Worthy point. I mean, you can't have yards per target. This is one of the elements of yards per target that's not necessarily a fair thing, because targets are identifying a lot of different things as a stat, and we know that they're earned and all of those things, but they are classified in terms of this guy earned the target, the ball was thrown his direction, but it doesn't mean it was necessarily catchable, but it still needs to be attributed to that player. If a guy's open deep and it's overthrown, it was still a deep target to that player. The air yard still existed. And yet the player can't do anything but get open deep, right? They can't catch the ball if it's overthrown. And so there's a really important element there. And when you have the really low catchable target rate, I mean, think about the concept of that. If somebody has a 60% catchable target rate and somebody has an 80% catchable target rate, 40% of my targets are not catchable. So how am I going to get yards on those targets? So it's going to impact my yards per target. It's going to impact my efficiency numbers. And the other person only has 20% that are, not catchable. And so, and Shawn, you wrote about this in the rookie guide and a lot of other places about the catch rate only on catchable targets, and how whether the individual players are actually bringing in the targets that are catchable, and how is the efficiency strong in those regards. And so, yeah, Worthy's an interesting one for sure. I'm with you on Worthy. We talked a little bit about him after we drafted him over Rashee Rice in one of our best ball drafts last week. His price continues to skyrocket. It's not going to stop. It's going to go ahead of Odunze, and it should, I think, in best ball. I voiced some concerns to you about the immediate usage, but when you start to hear Andy Reid compare him to Deshaun Jackson, that's where I get really intrigued, because they used Deshaun Jackson right away. That's not a player that Andy Reid waited on. And because of the lack of reliability of the other guys that they've tried to use in this specific type of speed role in the last couple of years, I'm talking about Kadarius Toney and Mecole Hardman, who they got rid of and then they brought back, and he still was Mecole Hardman. It's kind of hard to understand who they would keep Xavier Worthy off the field for. I mean, so you've got me. I told you by the end of our conversation, I'm definitely going to, or I think maybe early in our conversation, I'm definitely going to be chasing you up on Worthy. You've got me very excited about what that ceiling could look like. The conversation about the intermediate production from Worthy and the intermediate route running being pretty solid. And if you watch his tape, there's some stuff that, some clips and stuff that I've seen thrown around where he has some really good intermediate, just, from a film grinding perspective, some good route running for a guy. And we talked about this with his profile. Before he ran a 4.21, he still had a really interesting production profile. 3-year guy with a lot of, even with the lack of efficiency, the yards per out run are still solid because the targets per out run were really, really high. He earned volume. He's good at getting open. I believe that. I think that. And so if you add in that, he's good at getting open, but also he is going to be playing with Patrick Mahomes now. You're talking about the uncatchable target rate being super high when he played with Quinn Ewers. How much of the efficiency is on Worthy is up for debate, but that almost doesn't matter if you're now stepping into a situation where you're playing with the greatest quarterback of all time. Yeah.
If you run a 4.2 and you have Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes, you would probably have to be awful to not make that work. And I guess
shout out Mecole Hardman, who also was efficient. Mecole Hardman's yards per target he didn't get open, but his yards per target were through the roof early in his career, by the way.
He was able to score a lot of long touchdowns early before they got fed up with the fact that they couldn't actually use him in anything other than very gimmicky ways. Yeah, we'll see. That part of it will be interesting. And Ben, one of the things that you mentioned before I went in on Worthy there is this idea that I've said I'm high on Odunze, but that doesn't show up. And so it's not necessarily the case. And as you said that, it made me think about it in a way that, at least for me, helps contextualize some things, where I do think there's a difference between someone coming out and saying, look, I think that Odunze is overrated, and here are the warts, and here's where you want to be careful, and this is why I'm selling, and someone coming out and saying, I definitely see the pro thesis, maybe even the superstar thesis, and yet I'm ranking him here, and these are the reasons. Because the thing I kept mentioning to you in the emails, and I'm sure there are some listeners who were like, it's only a matter of time before these guys start referring to like the Pony Express delivering their messages. But for me, it's a matter of calibration on a variety of different pieces, not just one thing, right? And if I'm arguing that Odunze is actually a really good prospect and is going to be good, then partly I'm saying the draft is 10 deep. That's fairly straightforward. But the other thing is a matter of like, how are we looking at different types of potential rookie year outcomes, and how are we looking at the value of different positions and how that's likely to move throughout the course of a year. And one of the things that it's impossible not to go back to and look at is just that even in a position that holds its value really well, like a quarterback in Superflex, you can have outcomes that are on such extreme ends of the scale that the value change is dramatic. And CJ Stroud versus Bryce Young is a glaring example of that. If any of these quarterbacks are Stroud, then they're going to be in that battle for the 101 with him. And if it's Caleb Williams or Jaden Daniels, they're going to go ahead of him because they're probably going to give you some more rushing yards. If you do anything other than put up a Bryce Young type of year and you're a QB and you've managed successfully to navigate that rookie season, then your trade value over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years is going to be immense because you are the foundation player in the foundation position who is young. Now, one of the things for both Penix and Nix is that they're actually not that young. And that's one of the reasons why people specifically about Nix are not as high on him. That whole calculus there for Penix, I would argue, doesn't make that much sense. But when we look at JJ McCarthy, I have a hard time moving him down very far, even though I'm not personally a believer. And one of the notes that's come out since the draft that probably all the listeners more or less know is that the Vikings really, really tried to move up for May. And I think even that little nugget is interesting and probably does sort of crystallize May as being the guy, even if you think the situations are very, very different. I was reading Washington claiming the same thing was true for them, that they hadn't received a lot of offers, but the offer they did receive was for a bonanza. And they were like, no, we want Jaden Daniels. He's going to be a 15-year superstar for us. We don't care what you're willing to pay us. A similar thing is true in Dynasty, where at a certain point, it doesn't even matter what you're willing to pay for the QBs. You're not going to get them. And so when we look at the range of outcomes for guys like McCarthy and Nix, I do think that a year from now, they have an easier path to maintaining and increasing their trade value, which, a lot of people are like, yeah, we don't care about trade value. We want to win. But the two things are going to be linked. And when you're looking at how you position your Superflex roster so that you can't be stuck and only have one guy, and you think about all of the injuries that we've had to the QB position over the last couple of years, if you have two players, and that's kind of where you and I are, and we're hoping that our guys actually do stay healthy, and I think it's a viable way to play it. It's a little bit more of a gunslinging way to play it. But if you have the choice, and it doesn't cost you something else. Now, in this case, it costs you Odunze if you're going to say, well, you have Bo Nix ahead of him, right? But you want to be aware of how the third guy will help you either to protect you from injury, to stream if the second guy is close, or to then subsequently trade for so much that it completely changes your roster around. And so then we kind of get into this difference between, where do you have a guy ranked and where are you actually picking him and how does that dynamic work? And that's one of the reasons why I try and do the article the way that I do, to help people understand not just where I have people ranked, but how I'm playing it. And how I've been able to play it is mostly going after Nix around the 202. Mm-hmm. And I think that part of it is interesting. And Ben, one of the things that keeps jumping out to me as being something where there's a disconnect and you probably want to fix it one way or another, at least in your own mind, as you're thinking through these players, is that we have Troy Franklin dropping to day 3 and still in the mix with guys who went at the edge of the first and second round. The only possible way for that pick to work would be if Bo Nix is worth more like the 107, because Bo Nix is going to have to throw him the ball. And the idea that Troy Franklin can be like the only guy that succeeds in this Denver Broncos offense, and Marvin Mims has zero production, Cortland Sutton kind of ages out and has zero production, that path is pretty narrow. And, even going to something like, well, why did Troy Franklin fall? And the most obvious explanation is just that he's got a body type that hasn't been that successful. But one of the things that Blair floated to me, not really as a conspiracy theory, it's obviously just straightforward information, but a possibility would be that NFL GMs felt like part of Troy Franklin's production was fraudulent because he ranked number 1 in the country in catchable targets above expected. Well, who was pulling the trigger on those targets, right? It's Bo Nix. And so
Seems like the fact that he's playing with that same quarterback is relevant.
And I could have this completely and totally wrong. I want to put out there that, listeners know that I'm wrong about a bunch of stuff. The main thing for me is that I want to make sure that I'm thinking about the evidence, and I'm thinking about the evidence from a variety of perspectives, and don't get caught up in just like one angle on one part of a profile. And sometimes we do and don't know it, right? Which is one of the reasons why it's great to have these conversations and to get feedback from listeners who know a specific way in which we're wrong, because that does happen. But for Bo Nix, one of the things that people hate is that he has this really low ADOT. But when I'm writing about Bo Nix and looking at the numbers and looking at some research Travis has done on quarterbacks and how you can kind of split their passes out in a way that is a little bit more predictive. Now we know that it's very difficult to project quarterback prospects. There's just a lot of range in there. But you take out some of the shorter passes, you take out some of the plays with jet motion and play action, all those kinds of things. The surprising thing is that Bo Nix actually looks better when you take out all of his supposedly fraudulent production. But when you're thinking about what a guy is going to be at the NFL level, and if you're thinking about the Denver Broncos, and one of the things that they've more or less said is they think that he can run their offense. They think that he has the best ability to avoid the pressure, and they think he's the most accurate guy. Well, you would hope the team that actually took him believes that. That is important. It doesn't mean that's true because, again, that team is biased. But if those things are the case, would you then prefer to have a quarterback who only throws the deeper targets? Or would you prefer a quarterback who throws those targets okay and maybe doesn't have all of the deep shots, but can manage that intermediate area of the field and then also has a ton of underneath volume? Because the thing that I guess never quite makes sense for me is this idea that we wouldn't want somebody who's going to have a bunch of manufacturer production if there are actually plenty of reasons to believe that Sean Payton is also going to manufacture a bunch of production. Because even though, passing yards are not a very fast way to build up quarterback fantasy points, they matter. I mean, if he's going to have a bunch of successful underneath passes to his guys, all of those yards go into your fantasy bank account.
So I was the, hold up, let him cook meme there, where I had to let you cook a little bit on Bo Nix, because I love when you talk about him. I eat up every word that you are saying about Bo Nix there. I think it's pretty straightforward. Look at his numbers. I mean, he was around 77 or 78% completion percentage, broke the collegiate record. So if you want people want to say that the low ADOT is the reason for certain production, like it was just a few years back that Drew Brees in a Sean Payton offense became the first NFL quarterback to go over 70% completion for an NFL season. There's been a couple more that have done it, but like 72%-ish is like the record now, or 73. And Nix was 78%, which, to emphasize the 5 percentage point increase there, think about it in the inverse. I always like to say, like, well, there's X amount of incompletions, and he had like 20% fewer incompletions, right? Like there's like 25 percentage points of incompletions. And then for Nix, there's more like 20% percentage points of incompletions. I mean, he was, for every 5 incompletions, Nix only had 4. He completed another pass. When he's already that efficient, then, that's on the NFL side, but then the most efficient NFL seasons of all time. It's insane to get close to 80% completion percentage on a pass. And so, like, there's drops, there's all sorts of things that can happen. There's throwaways, there's spikes. I mean, there's lots of things that can happen. But when you start talking about, well, if you pull out all the short passing, he's still good down the field. That's the only way you can get to a 78 completion. Like, people are not paying attention to how good of a completion percentage he had, how accurate he clearly was in every throw on the field to be able to do what he did. Now, the low ADOT does inflate that, but once you adjust for that, you're still talking about, like, okay, ADOT adjusted 70% completion percentage is still a 70% completion percentage, right? Like it's still a very accurate player. And as you emphasized, if we're knocking Troy Franklin for having so many on-target downfield passes, what does that say about Bo Nix? And that the numbers actually do on Bo Nix's side back that up when you account for all of that. But the other thing I just want to say about the low ADOT thing is, like, ADOT is an average. Like, I always would think about this in terms of Drew Brees as well. The volume is relevant. And it's the same thing with Patrick Mahomes that we've talked about a ton. with the low ADOT stuff, where people have then tried to compare him to other guys on a per attempt basis. It's an average. How many times he throws matters. It's not. So when we bucket out downfield passing, if it's two players have the same amount of downfield passing, and then one also throws a ton of underneath passes and completes all of those, his average is going to come way down. The other guy's going to have a higher ADOT and look more efficient per target. But the guy that has all the underneath passing is doing more. He's throwing the same passes down the field and doing more underneath and doing it efficiently and well. And instead of running the ball in this offense, they're using his underneath passing to move the chains. That's like, it's an average. And for a quarterback, a passing ADOT especially, you need to think about this. For a receiver, the ADOT is a little bit different because it really tells you something about role, and there's only a certain type of distribution that can exist on, 100-ish targets on the high end or whatever, 150 targets on the high end in the NFL level, whatever it is. Like the ADOT is a little bit more specific to what the player is. For a quarterback, you're talking about 450, 550, 650 pass attempts. The distribution's a huge deal. The average is relevant. Just because a guy has a low ADOT does not mean he's a dink and dunker. It might mean that he throws a lot more. He drops back a lot more, and he does throw underneath a lot. But because it's a lot more volume, that's what's bringing down the average. He's still throwing down the field is the point, right? And that's sort of what you were describing with Nix, where there's still a lot there. When he did go down the field, he went down the field effectively. When he went underneath, he completed stuff and moved the chains. And that's the way you have to play at the NFL level now with the cover two shells and all that stuff. You have to be able to matriculate it down the field. You have to be able to take the underneath throws. He's a perfect fit for Sean Payton. That's what I mentioned about the Drew Brees thing. That's the way they ran that offense for years with the Saints. I'm not saying they're going to throw 600 times in Denver this year, but Drew Brees is one of the first quarterbacks that you could rely on for 600 pass attempts every single season, and he'd complete a really high percentage of them, and the Saints offense would have all sorts of passing volume. Now, one concern there is their receivers wouldn't necessarily smash because they would rotate receivers a little bit and they'd throw underneath and all of that. But to your point, people are still drafting Troy Franklin in the second round of rookie drafts in the same range as, Ricky Pearsall, who went the first round. He went way, way higher in terms of draft capital. And you mentioned this point to me before the show. I said, you have to make sure to say it on the show. I just want to emphasize it again. It's completely incongruent to have Troy Franklin as a fourth round wide receiver elevated to the second round of rookie drafts above his draft capital and not also be intrigued by Bo Nix. That does not jive. And you pointed that out and just laid it out. And I just wanted to reemphasize your point there because it's incredibly strong. Having said all of that and agreeing and loving your points on Bo Nix, the questions that I got were, why do you have Rome Odunze so low? Now, you are addressing that to a degree by talking about the guys you have ranked ahead of him. But one of the things you mentioned in your write-up that you do is talk about how to play it. And one of the things you did talk about in the Rome Odunze section is that you weren't really looking to move down from that pick if you're in that position. But if you are in that position with Odunze, you could potentially try to create a bidding war, trade out. If you have a need at running back, maybe go grab a running back. I had someone mention this to me, and it was like, if Sean is saying that he has Odunze ranked 10th and also that he would trade out to go draft a running back, and Sean's never drafted a running back in his life. This is the 0 RB guy. He must hate this player. So I do want to, before we, close the show today, I do want you give me some of the negatives for Rome Odunze. I'm irrationally high on him. Those who have listened to me, who have read me since the RotoViz days, will remember I was irrationally high on John Ross as well. I always like to try to emphasize my impartiality with the Huskies by saying stuff like, I was very low on Dante Pettis when he was a second round pick. I did not think he was going to be good. I was low on Dwayne Washington when he was he was a free agent waiver wire pickup for the Saints that everyone wanted to bid on. And I was like, don't bid on this guy. My track record on Huskies is actually pretty solid, in part because I've been actually down on a lot of the guys. I wasn't doing content then, but you can go back to Jake Locker. I was pretty confident Jake Locker was not going to be a very good NFL player. Maybe that's just my own self-defeatist personality, but
Jake Locker's stats were not good.
They were not good. He was really athletic and he had a huge arm, but he was somebody who missed a lot of throws. And I was like, this guy's not accurate enough to be a top 10 pick, no matter what his athleticism is. I think Jalen Polk is going to probably be a little bit of a disappointment at the NFL level. He did a lot of really cool stuff, but we've talked about that on the show, Sean. did a lot of cool stuff at UW, made a lot of great plays. I love him and I always will. But I think what he really does the best is some of the vertical stuff. And I just don't know how it's going to translate in the modern NFL either. Like, I think he'll make some explosive plays, but I just don't know where the consistency is going to be there. I care a lot about consistency at receiver. Jalen McMillan, I've talked about, I could see it hit if one of the Huskies hit, but he was pretty unreliable in college. I also am skeptical of him, to be honest. Both those guys go day 2. I'm skeptical of Michael Penix, but Rome Odunze is really good, Shawn. And so I need you to tell me and the listeners who are also intrigued what we should be worried about with Odunze. And I know you do like him and you do like the profile, but it's important to get all sides of it. And this is not saying you're out on Odunze or you hate him or you think he'll never be good. One of the and part of the reason I led into your last opportunity to speak by breaking down 9 million things was I'm trying to be like, this is what I need you to address, Shawn. This is what I need in my head answered. The Rome Odunze thing, one of the things you did talk about was how good his competition will be with the Bears. And that's a fair point. At the same time, it's different than the JSN situation. JSN went into a situation where DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett had played under Shane Waldron for 2 years, had played alongside Geno Smith for all of the year prior and part of the year prior to that. So almost, not even 1.5 years, but more than a year. Had about 100 plus dropbacks the year prior, and then a full season after that. So they knew the quarterback, they knew the offense, they were entrenched. This is a situation where you have a new quarterback. You have Shane Waldron again, who a lot of people have mentioned is obviously the guy that didn't get a lot out of JSN in the number 3 role last year. But these are different players, Odunze and JSN, different roles in a system potentially. And he has not coached Keenan Allen or DJ Moore in any particular role yet, and has not coached Caleb Williams has not thrown passes to either of those guys yet. And so it feels a little bit more open. And one of the things we've talked about, or at least in the JSN situation, it's still obviously a ton of really good players, of really good competition. Because Cole Kmet is another name that we talked about having a surprisingly strong 2023 season when you really peel back the numbers last year. The Bears have an awesome receiving core. I get that element of it. But in the past, when we've had these log jams, we've had to be aware of what the chaos can occur and what can happen and how can guys wind up in situations that are beneficial to them. Keenan Allen is a 32-year-old with hamstring issues in his past. We love him. He's incredible. But there's paths to him missing time. We talk about Xavier Worthy. One of the big things with Xavier Worthy is he's playing alongside Travis Kelce. He's 34. He's 2 years even older than Keenan Allen. But the market is down on both Kelce and Keenan Allen. I think in a large part because of age. You look at their underdog ADPs, they're lower than they probably should be, or at least Allen's was. I think it's adjusted. It's sort of like where it should have adjusted to now that Odunze did land there and they're so stacked. But sometimes we think through the upside, obviously, of rookies late in the season, the potential for, injuries with older players or age cliffs or what have you. And so, that's the point I'm trying to draw between Kelce and Keenan Allen. And in Kelce's case, he's entrenched. He's played with Patrick Mahomes for all these years. Keenan Allen has never played with Caleb Williams, is an older receiver. He played incredibly well last year. I don't think he's going to hit an age cliff immediately. I don't think it's certain that he'll get hurt. He's very, very good. And DJ Moore is very, very good. But I think the people that are really optimistic about Odunze, like myself, think it's possible that Odunze could just, number one, be as good as them out the gate and potentially compete for volume right away. Number two, that if opportunity opens up, that it's there for Odunze. And so, and I would, I guess, classify that as consistent with how I would understand your perception of a rookie landing into this type of situation, even though there is a lot of competition. And so the question is, what is it about Odunze's profile specifically? And I've alluded to some of it earlier. He's a little bit of a later breakout, all of those things. But I do think it's worth discussing. And you made some interesting points to me in our conversation about how people are sort of blowing by some of the bust risk with Odunze. And for me, for my own sanity, because I probably, without talking to you, would draft 50% Odunze this year across all formats, I want to hear the concerns, because nobody really is laying out the Odunze concerns. I think that's a fair point.
One of the things that I love about Odunze is that he had a monster final season, and he was good across all levels. He was a great downfield guy. He's great with the ball in his hands. Then he tests as a fantastic athlete with size. I mean, those elements are hard to not look at and feel like he's going to be a superstar. As I'm looking at him, I'm just trying to make sure that I keep myself a little bit in check and see the whole profile. And if there's anything else there, I have to apologize because I should know who the tweet was from. But Michael Dubner shared in our RotoViz Slack at one point a tweet about Odunze and the fact that more or less all other top 10 or top 15 picks with the year 2 and year 3 yards per team attempt numbers of Odunze had busted. And my initial response to that was that, yes, we want to be aware of some of those kinds of things, but I'm going to push back on that and say I don't think that's super relevant within the context of what Odunze has done.
Because he went to Washington, he was a Husky, and that means that he's impervious to buff.
Exactly. Now I feel like I'm almost on the other side of it, where people are so excited about Odunze that I'm just like, I don't want to tell you in any way, shape, or form that he's not going to be successful, but like there is this mild red flag. We want to evaluate more than just the very final year, which is true for both Worthy and Odunze in different directions, obviously. When I'm looking at Odunze, Worthy, McCarthy, and Nix, some of this is a matter of where you had them pre-draft. And for me, I would have Odunze 7, Worthy 8, Nix 9, and McCarthy 10. And depending on how much you want to be agnostic to where you expect them to go in the draft, I would have had McCarthy ahead because I didn't think that he had a risk of falling into a terrible situation, whereas Nix definitely did. And when he didn't, that cleared up a lot of the sort of lingering concerns I had for him, because there were landing spots that I think would have made it difficult for him to be successful. But if you have that ranking, and then but they were close, right? They weren't separated in the way that some people have them separated, which is worth noting. I mean, some people have them separated in a huge, huge way. And for them coming in and saying, oh, but the landing spot, you're like, no, the landing spot doesn't matter with where you have them spread in your rankings. Your evaluation is what should tell you where they should go. And so for people who are saying that's where they're at with them, I have no problem with that at all. For me, when I have Odunze above them, but I have them all in the same tier, and then the names that pop out to me when I sort of reshuffle, I'm like 107, okay, the names that are relevant to me there, in addition to the players, which again, I've said I have in a fairly tight range, the names that are relevant to me there are Patrick Mahomes and Andy Reid. I go to 108, and I have that as JJ McCarthy. The like really quick just headlines for me there are going to be Dome coach Justin Jefferson. And then when I go to 9, Sean Payton. And then when I go to 10, the names that are popping out to me are, well, Shane Waldron to start with, but then Keenan Allen and DJ Moore. And I think back to these previous situations, and I'm like, T. Higgins and Tyler Boyd, Jamar Chase-Lynn's there. DJ Moore and Keenan Allen are both better than both of those guys. Amari Cooper and Michael Gallup. Moore and Keenan Allen, again, both better than both of those guys. And the one that's probably a little bit more controversial when I'm thinking about JSN going with DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. And some people are going to be like, well, you're not right because of where Metcalf is in his career and where Allen is in his career. But I think you just look back to last season and you're like, DJ Moore and Keenan Allen, both better than both of those guys. So then we're thinking about it from a dynasty perspective. It becomes trickier if you have some concerns about, Soldier Field, about the rookie QB, about the offensive coordinator that also layer on in a very, very thin way. I'm not saying anybody should be making their decisions on those elements, but when we're pulling in the full context, for me, it matters a little bit. I would say that if there's a hole in the way that I'm looking at this, it's probably not attaching enough of a probability or thinking about the scenarios in which one of those other two receivers goes down. It's tough to stay healthy in the NFL. It's certainly been tough the last couple of years for Keenan Allen. He actually had a very long stretch in the middle of his career where he played basically every game that I think, maybe people aren't thinking in terms of, but he is older now, right? There is a very real chance that one of those two guys goes down. Once that happens, yeah, I mean, an Odunze eruption, I would say you can probably count on that. But again, it's a matter of if the four guys are close. Those other names, those other tiny elements do matter for me. And again, I'm not pushing anybody to move off of him if you're on him. And part of like how to play it and the trade down thing as I'm reading it, partly it's like, I don't expect Odunze to be there for you at 110 ever. So when you're trading out of that spot, it would be trading out of somebody that you probably don't like as much if you have a normal ranking. And if you can get the price though, and get Jonathan Brooks, yeah, especially in Dynasty, like how can he hold his value versus the receiver? And yet at the same time, I mean, Brooks has some pretty amazing comps. And I guess I'm not as worried about the landing spot as a lot of people are. You get a huge workload, which is he's going to get a lot of touches. He's going to get a lot of receiving touches. And, once you get into that, 17, 18 EP per game range as a running back, and then you have the ability to put up, maybe he plays successfully for 6 years. As you mentioned, that can be actually a big exaggeration on what's likely. But say he has like a 5-year period, and most of it comes in year 2 through year 5 because of the injuries coming off of. Although I get the impression he is going to be pretty close to 100%. But if it's 2 through 5, and in 2 of those years he puts up a 3 FPOE season, so you get 3 fantasy points over expectation in addition to his EP, and you're scoring 21, 22 points per game, that separates for you at a position where, I think it's harder to get that separation there, even though getting the depth, as we talked about earlier in the show, getting the depth is no problem at all. You can do that in round 3. So Brooks is controversial to me in a whole different way, because you're talking about positional value versus the chance that you get a guy who actually does gap at that position. And anytime guys can gap, it completely changes the scoring environment when you're talking about, when you go in the fantasy semifinals, what's the projected score? When you get in the finals, what's the projected score? Now, within that projected score, you get a very wide range of what could happen, which is why you get some of these frustrating situations where you have the powerhouse 101 seed, 1 seed, you lose. You get the 6th seed, you go on a run, you win. It's one of the reasons why we want to make the playoffs every year. But certainly if you're trying to maximize your chance to win that championship game, if you've got gappers at the different positions, you're going to have a tiny edge on maybe a 0 RBer who has just guys in the running back spot. Again, their whole lineup matters, but in a dynasty league, you want to have stars everywhere, right? I mean, Ben, we're not trying to build like a just good dynasty roster. Like this is a roster that's above average. It's like we want to build the best dynasty roster you can possibly build. A dynasty team that's an empire is going to be far better than the best redraft team can possibly be. Let's build those teams.
I tried to get you to zero in on Odunze, and you decided to explain why we need to value running backs higher and try to acquire running backs as a whole higher, and Jonathan Brooks as well. No, you talked a lot about Odunze there. I didn't hear a whole lot of negative about Odunze. I've concluded that you do truly love Rome Odunze. I think as you talked through it, and as we talked much earlier in this marathon episode about being aware of, in Dynasty, the way that year 1 production can impact value, there are probably a lot of scenarios where Odunze has a disappointing year 1 as a result of everyone else staying healthy. You talk about like the Soldier Field element and all that, and it is interesting. I mean, the Bears have never really had a good passing game, right? They've never had Caleb Williams. They've never had receivers produce anywhere near. I mean, this could be, depending on how things go, the 3 best receivers in Bears history. I mean, you can almost like start to make that conversation. It's fascinating to think about how things will look for Chicago, but if it is Keenan Allen and DJ Moore that really dominate, and Odunze is sort of being brought behind a little bit more slowly as a rookie in a way that doesn't even suggest that he's a bust, but is maybe more like what we saw from JSN in year 1. I mean, obviously that's possible. And if that type of thing occurs, you do see a value decline for an Odunze as a result. And so, yeah, I mean, I think as you talked through that, as I tried to listen for the key points on Odunze's profile specifically, I think what I took from it was that you do like some of the guys around it, or around him, that you have ranked around him, both in front of and behind. And some of your concerns with Odunze aren't massive concerns with Odunze necessarily. You don't think he's going to be a massive bust or anything like that. And the way that I said it to you is,
cancel me on Odunze with.
I know, I was trying so hard. I was trying to get something that I could dunk on you when Odunze goes for like 203 TDs in week 1. But unfortunately, he wouldn't allow it. But one of the things that, as we talked through it, I sort of mentioned to you is like, I was joking about you can't say that you like him and rank him this low and have people asking me, how does he have him so low? I mean, because then relative to the market, you don't like him. But I also, was saying to you, like, I don't think that you're being disingenuous in that point. I think that part of what you're saying is that, not that the market's wrong, because that's often viewed as overconfidence, and you are always talking about a humility-based approach, but that you are willing to take these stands where sometimes the market isn't weighing certain elements of the profile in a way that you think is correct. And as a result, you're just going to have a guy at a different spot than others. And I think we're all going to do that at times. And through all of, for the listeners, to wrap up all of our written communications and everything I heard you say here, through all of that, what I've taken away from it is that your opinion on it is more or less not that you're really low on Odunze or think he's really bad, that you genuinely do think he's good and has an interesting range of outcomes. And you just talk through, like, one of the things maybe that you're undervaluing is if one of the other receivers gets hurt, that he could probably be really, really good in that situation. But rather that most other people aren't adjusting enough for, this is, again, my interpretation of what I would say is your thoughts here, but most of our conversations did end up becoming about Bo Nix. But anyway, on the Odunze thing, it's just that it seems like your thinking is to be willing to take a stand and say that I do think that the range of outcomes with where his value can go and what can happen in year 1 production and what that will mean for ability to acquire him later and all of those things should be a little bit lower than some of these quarterbacks, because this is a super flex ranking situation. So the JJ McCarthy, Bo Nix stuff, we've talked about this before. The quarterbacks really retain their value and can be so important to get when you have the opportunity to get them in rookie drafts, because they really are an undervalued asset. It's so much more fun to take anything other than quarterbacks, and we're so conditioned in redraft to take anything other than quarterbacks. But the reality is, if Bo Nix goes out and is a Sean Payton quarterback, like, his value is going to be a lot higher than, I mean, even if Odunze is a pretty solid hit, like the quarterback in Superflex it's worth multiple pieces in trades. I mean, it's just the way that it goes. It's hard to get quarterbacks, and when you want to get one, you got to pay for it.
One of the things I would say too on the ranking there is that, in part, I get some freedom to have weirder rankings because I don't have to deal with the deluge from social media. But I also want to point out that I think it's really important for analysts to be willing to provide some unique perspectives that are not, I mean, probably a lot of people would be like, if you were on social media, you'd know that people are willing to throw out all kinds of crazy takes. Like, crazy takes, there's no shortage of that. But I do want to note that when people are trying to figure out a wisdom of crowds and are working through these types of things, if analysts who have kind of gone through a process on somebody and come to a conclusion that is different from the other serious analysts, right? And just because people throw out hot takes doesn't mean they're not serious overall. I don't want to give that impression either. If there's nothing wrong with having fun when you're out there interacting with people. But if you're not willing to actually put your ranking out there, then you don't get a true wisdom of crowds, because we're just all following what the previous thing that was said or happened was. Even if I'm wrong, and again, I'm wrong all the time, if I don't actually give my true thoughts on these prospects, then I'm not helping like get to the average of the community either, because I'm not giving my real answers. And that's one of the reasons I also do try and provide, hints on how to play it, so that somebody who maybe doesn't understand where I'm off from the community makes a pick that they later regret. So they're like, I thought I could follow Shawn Siegele and I'd be okay. But he gave me this really weird ranking and it was a bad pick. And it cost me a bunch of ADP spots that I didn't need to pay. So it's one of the reasons that I have a hard time with rankings, because I know not everybody wants to read the articles and not everybody has time to listen to the podcasts. I don't necessarily have time for everything I would like to do. So when people want the quick answer, I can certainly understand if sometimes my quick answer is wrong, but the context matters. And being able to say, this is what I think the guys should be ranked at, even if it turns out not to be the case, it's important for the entire process to work.
I think that's a great point. I really do. I mean, in a hypothetical situation, because I was kind of saying this to you, is like, I think part of the reason people are asking this question is like, if you had Odunze ranked 8, I think people would still think you were low on him, that he's not really ever going later than 8. And I'm looking at the list of drafts you have here, the 7 drafts. He went 8 once, never went lower than 8. He went 7 twice. He went 6 twice. He went 6 twice, and he went 4 once ahead of Neighbors. So really was pretty heavily in that 6-7 range. The 8 was a little bit of an outlier on one side. The 4 was an outlier on the other side. So early on, people had him like maybe on par with Neighbors or ahead of Neighbors. I even said that on some shows. The more I dug into the profiles, especially after I wrote up my Targets Per Route Run piece in early April, I came to accept and understand that there should be a gap there. That Odunze is certainly going to slot in behind him. And he mostly is the wide receiver 3 in these, and falling in a gap from Neighbors down to him where there's a pretty clear tier break. You're seeing Bowers go. You're seeing the other quarterbacks go. And yet he's still going ahead of like JJ McCarthy in a lot of these. I think most of these, if I'm not mistaken. So the point being, if you would have had Odunze at 8 and McCarthy at 9 and Nix at 10, you still would have been higher than market on Nix. You still would have been, relatively close to market on JJ, which is sort of where you wound up anyway. And I think how you feel about him. And you still would have been relatively low on Odunze. And yet it does, like, that would have just been weighing in the ADP, and it sort of would have been ranking it that way just to satisfy people that are going to say, why are you so low on Odunze? Why do you hate Odunze? And your point about the wisdom of the crowds thing is well taken, that by putting Odunze where you actually believe he is, and we have this conversation and we think through it, I think you make a valid point. I do think you make a fair point, even as a huge Odunze fan, that there hasn't been any adjustment for him. I ultimately like the Bears landing spot. I said this a little bit on the round 1 stream, where I think the long term is a good setup for him and he can be successful there. But at the same time, I can understand, from all the reasons we talked about, how Dynasty actually is more of a year-to-year game than people want to admit, that you do have to be aware of the fact that there's now risk to his early profile. And you talked about there's some bust risk, and there's some cohort of players that have gone this high and not done that well in yards per team attempt in years 2 and 3. And most of those guys have busted, and how that's a possibility for Odunze, and that your inclination was to push back on that particular thing, because there is unique elements. There's the COVID year. And in Odunze's case, there's a big element of a massive coaching change and some shifts there. A different quarterback in his first 2 seasons. They brought in Penix for his 3rd season. It was not a competent passing offense. I could tell you as a Husky fan. My Husky friends all through, not just the COVID year of 2020, which was only 4 games, but the 2021 season, heard me constantly complain about how ancient our offense was, which is why I got so excited when we would talk about how Kalen DeBoer's offense was so much more modern and used motion and misdirection and all that stuff. The 2021 Huskies under Jimmy Lake offensively would just line up and be so predictable and just run it on 1st and 10 every time, run, pass, all the, none of the schemes were interesting, no motion, no misdirection, not even much play action. It was a pro style 1995 offense. It was gross. And anyway,
I'll probably cover a lot more of this in the divisional shows, but are you fired up about how that could help the Seahawks this year?
I think a little bit. It's a little hard because Ryan Grubb was the offensive coordinator with DeBoer. They worked together at Fresno State as well. It's a little hard to know how much of it was DeBoer, who's an offensive-minded head coach, and how much of it was Grubb. They kind of did it together was sort of the idea. And when DeBoer went to Alabama, Grubb was going to go with him to Alabama as well. And then after he accepted the Alabama job, he got the Seahawks offer. I've had a lot of questions about that. I think it's a little hard to tell. I think one of the things that I really liked about them, and I talked about this a little bit, I wrote about it a little bit in Stealing Signals during the season last year as an example of sort of innovative football tactics, was that they would evolve and they would show. So the way that I wrote about it, I remember last year, and emphasizing the UW thing, was that exit motion that got really popular early, that I think Mike McDaniel was the first one to do it. And then Shanahan and McVay did it the very next week. And they talked about how it's a copycat league. Everyone's watching everyone. It got me so hyped. Then that exit motion being the short motion, the thing that McDaniel was doing with Tyreek Hill, where he would have him almost lined up as a tight end and motion him to the same side. So he's sort of splitting him just out wide, not running him all the way across the formation, but the same side motion, but moving him off his spot so he gets a free release because he's already in movement, and then up the field. And then what he loved to do with him was then kind of turn into a banana route, have him curl back in on like a 15-yard intermediate crosser, and that's where they kept hitting Tyreek Hill wide open in the middle of the field so many times. And if you get that little exit motion, it helps to free up that player, because a cornerback, he's not backpedaling against a guy who's starting from stopping. He's chasing already at the start of the snap. Anyway, that was an exciting innovation in 2023. Other NFL teams copied it. We heard McVay and Shanahan talk about that. I got so excited to see the Huskies do it in like week 5. It was like early in the year, week 4 or week 5. And I'm like, man, like, it's cool when your college team is watching enough tape that they see the thing that is being copycatted around the NFL, but not all the way around the NFL. There was only like 5 or 10 teams that really started to do it at the NFL level. There's a lot of NFL teams that don't copycat as much as they should. They're so old school that they're not implementing things even when they look cool. That was something that I loved about the Huskies, was like, these guys they're seeing stuff that's happening at the NFL level, and they're implementing it. And they didn't do anything exciting with the exit motion, but they just showed it. And I think when you just show it on film, that's another look that other people have to consider. I loved how multiple the Huskies offense was and all of those things. I think it's got to be difficult to coach that. And I think it's difficult to get everyone. And so also I've told you this, Sean, but other people were asking me like, what do you think about JSN in a specific role? I had someone ask me in the Jalen McMillan role. And I was like, I don't know that Jalen McMillan had like a specific role in this offense. It was too multiple. It was too many different formations, too much motion. It was very fun. And the short answer is yes, I'm excited for what that could mean for the Seahawks. It's better than any other step, I think. To be trying to move that direction is the right direction to be trying to move. But it's interesting to see how Grubb will implement it, how successful he'll be, and how he'll be able to evolve and adjust in season. Because that's the point I'm really trying to drive home. Is I loved how the UW offense adjusted in season, and it wasn't just misdirection within a play. It was misdirection within a season. It's like, this is what we know we've put on film, and now we'll show that same formation and do things a little bit differently. And so this team, we know how they're preparing on us, but we're going to continue to evolve. It's like they were changing their offense throughout the year. It's not just implementing it in the offseason and then running an offense for the whole year, and then by the end of the year someone's figured it out. And I think that's the way you got to do it in modern NFL, with the data and the film and the way that people can break things down. You have to know what you're putting on film and evolve between it. I've told the story on here before, I know, of seeing that as a kid with a Peyton Manning, or not a kid, a younger, with Peyton Manning when he was with the Broncos. A play with Wes Welker where he ran a little 3-yard dig in the red zone, and they got this TD, and it was like a week 2 play. And then week 7, they're breaking it down on like NFL Live or something. Week 7, they show the exact same formation. The cornerback tries to jump it, but Welker runs a whip and goes back to the outside. And they emphasize that this play hasn't been on the Broncos film. And any other play, they didn't go back to it for 6 weeks until they're facing this cornerback that is a veteran cornerback. Can't remember who it was, but Manning knew he was going to watch film and was going to try to jump this route, because it's the exact same. Welker split out as the only receiver on the short side of the field. and he's running the exact same quick dig in the red zone that Manning used to love, and then he runs it in as a whip, and the cornerback over pursues it. It's a walk-in touchdown. And the whole idea is like, you don't go back to that successful play again. You go back to a variation of that successful play. You show the exact look. You make the defense who's watching film and preparing think that you're running that play again, but you don't go back to it again. That's the mistake the Seahawks made in the Super Bowl. They went to that trips play. Malcolm Butler picked it off when that conversation was discussed later. The Patriots talked about how they saw that play on film. They knew that was one of the Seahawks sort of hurry up 3 receiver options. And if you've put that on film ever, a good coach is, Bill Belichick's going to have you prepared in the Super Bowl that this is the play that they're going to run out of that set. So anyway, that's a really long answer, but I think it's exciting if you're a Seahawks fan. I think it's interesting to see what Grubb can do. I don't know enough about Grubb detached from DeBoer to be confident of anything, but it's a step in the right direction for sure, and it could be really exciting.
And you talk about the creativity, the ability to evolve, and to have plays ready for situations. The Chiefs, again, a great example of that. The 49ers talking about how so many of the plays in the second half of the Super Bowl on the big plays, the high leverage plays, they had not seen the Chiefs ever run. And so again, that gives me confidence for Worthy. It's like they're going to be able to figure out ways to use him. One of the things too, I just, kind of as we conclude here, I don't think anybody's under any misimpressions about what I think of JSN or that type of thing. But I do think there's probably still plenty of people listening who are like, I don't understand why they're mentioning JSN with Odunze in terms of the difficulty of coming out and dealing with veteran incumbents, because they're two different guys. I mean, Odunze, a bigger guy, maybe a more vertical guy, gets drafted in the top 10 picks. JSN, falls into that 20 range. The NFL wasn't as excited about him. But, I mean, and those things are very real and valid. I'm not ignoring those at all. But when we look at the overall profile again, I mean, you're talking about that 2021 season from JSN. He averaged a full yards per route more. 1 yard for every single route more than Odunze. He averaged 2.5 yards more per target. He averaged 14 more yards per game. And he did it while playing with Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave. So, so much of what we think about JSN now is based on how he failed last year, right? It's not necessarily based on what he was coming out. Again, it could be that my evaluation of JSN outside of some of those facts. I mean, you go back to like Marvin Harrison. When did he break out? Well, he broke out with the 3 touchdown bowl game that year. JSN had 300 plus yards and 3 touchdowns in that bowl game when he's playing with Marvin Harrison. And so,
but I do want to emphasize, because you've said a couple times now, like Odunze's yards per team attempt in his final season matched Worthy's yards per team attempt in his freshman season. One note on that is that we noted that Worthy got a little bit worse the next 2 years after that. That was Worthy's best season. So their best seasons were comparable, although Worthy's came
I'm talking about JSN.
And then in this comparison as well, you're saying how much better JSN was than Odunze. And the point I want to emphasize is JSN's numbers that year were absurd. They were like, that's why we loved JSN. In both cases, I don't think you're trying to say that Odunze is bad, but it comes across yeah.
I think that right. No, and I mentioned the reasons off the top about being a bigger vertical receiver drafted in the top 10. As I do think it gives you more pathways, although, I mean, Amon-Ra St. Brown's like, if you want to draft the little guys at 100, we'll just go out there and score 20 fantasy points a game and beat everybody. It's like, I'm going to do the same thing to people who don't draft me in fantasy that I did to all the teams who didn't draft me in reality. Again, JSN, he got knocked down by this stuff. And or maybe he's a bust. Guys do bust even with great profiles.
That's a hard one for me to accept after 1 year, especially the way he was used. And we'll have a lot more about JSN. Yeah, all I was saying was that if we compare anyone to fantastic seasons, they're going to look bad. I don't think you were trying to do that. But Odunze did have a good final season. It's not like his numbers were bad. They were good.
No,
they were fantastic. Great. I do want to emphasize that. For anyone who's like, well, why does Shawn keep saying that all these players were way, way better than Odunze or equally as good, way, way younger? It's like, well, I mean, Let's like, you know, at
And the
least be a
best
little.
seasons in recent fantasy football history have been better than Rome Odunze.
Those are all true facts. Yes, they are. But Adunze did have a really good year last year alongside two day two receivers who, I mean, most of the analytical arguments against those guys move back toward, inconsistency and stuff like that. And it's like, well, I mean, because they had to play alongside Rome Odunze. Like, he's the reason why. He was the clear alpha. At the same time, I just got done saying how exciting the Huskies offense was. And this is where we agree. And I've talked to you about this since last fall when I was so excited about the Huskies. It's why I'm a little bit lower than consensus on Penix as well, and on Polk and on McMillan, that I do think the scheme elevated in this case. But Odunze, I think, was truly spectacular. And so he's a tricky one. And it's going to be interesting to follow how his career develops. I had some funny tweets about him where people are comparing him to JSN in this regard of, because of the landing spot, because of the competition, his value could drop like JSN's did in Dynasty after 1 year. And we talked through that a little bit. I think you make some fair points. But I said sort of, that's the weaker argument. The better argument is because of the landing spot, if his value. I said that he could be on the AJ Brown value path, not the AJ Brown actual career path necessarily, but his value didn't actually drop. I thought he would end up going around like 110, the way that people were talking about him. So I was saying, like, people were going to have this post-draft evaluation of him where his value tumbled. It didn't, except for in Shawn Siegele's rankings.
So Ben has one up me in the end. He gets the AJ Brown victory lap, the victory finish. Ben and I both loved AJ Brown. It turns out that only one of us is going to be on the side of glory with Rome Odunze. I already don't like the way that's making me feel, Ben, because there's going to be glory there. And as we always say, you can't buy glory. That's going to finish up another one of our longer Stealing Bananas episodes. If you're listening to this intro, then you listen to the full audio. We really appreciate you doing that. It's been so much fun bringing it to you in the longer form like this. My name, as always, is Shawn Siegele. I'm with Ben Gretch. Make sure you follow him at Yards Per Gretch, at Stealing Signals, at Stealing Lines. He referenced a number of fantastic articles in the show today. You won't want to miss what he's got coming this summer. I have teased a couple times the divisional preview shows that I think have been among our favorites to record. Certainly, we've gotten great feedback on them. They are coming. Stick with us for that. We'd love to have you guys over at RotoViz. Coupon code RVRadio2024 at checkout. As I mentioned, sign up for the Best Ball Banana Stand. Join me over at OT with Colin Kelly. I know all of you guys are listening to fantasy football's greatest show, Ship Chasing, every week. We love you guys. We'll talk to you soon.